Hey guys, this is Tobias with Framehouse 3D, and today I was going to show you a basic workflow from Houdini, Arnold Render for Houdini, going into a compositing package like Fusion. I decided to make this video because I ran into some troubles the other day on a project with regard to the OpenEXR formats and compatibility between versions of applications. So, for instance, Arnold Render utilizes the current standard, which is 2.4, I believe, or 2.2 for OpenEXR, while some packages out there for compositing are a little bit behind on it, so they're using 1.7 or something in between. Um, what does that mean? Basically, is that when you save a image sequence to an EXR bundle, which basically, if you don't know what an EXR is, it's basically an image format that allows you to store multiple passes into one image as opposed to batches of image sequences. So, for instance, your beauty pass and your specular and your reflections and your shadows and all that stuff are all stored into one image EXR, and then you can extract that later on just from that one file, as opposed to bringing in different folders of each pass and then connecting them all together. Now, normally that's something that works very well, and it helps streamline the process, but sometimes when you run into problems like what we have now with this versioning issue, sometimes the compatibility doesn't jive, so you have to do some workarounds. Anyway, long story short, I wanted to show you a way to do this with the current versions of Houdini 16 and Arnold Render and BlackMagic Fusion 8.2. For some of you out there, this is going to be very rudimentary. I would characterize this as a basic workflow tutorial, but I did a quick search out there just to see if there was anything out there, and I didn't find anything. And whenever I come across that, I see that as an opportunity to help others with this kind of information. So here we go. I'm just going to create a very basic scene in Houdini, and I'm going to show you how to create all the different AOV passes, and even get those separated out into the folders, the separate EXRs, and I'll explain why we're doing that as we go. Alright, so let's just get started by building a simple scene here. So we'll just create ourselves a grid and a couple of shapes, alright, that we can work with. And let's just make this grid really big, and we'll just organize these shapes a little bit. Just bring this up. It's the hair, torus object, box. Alright, now this is going to be, like I said, a very basic scene. We just want to talk about the basic workflow and stuff here. Alright, so there we go. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is get our Arnold situation set up. So let's go ahead and add a Arnold Render operator. So we have that there. And then we're going to hop in and create materials for each of these objects that we have. So we'll go into our shop network, and I like to start from scratch with shader networks. Some of you may not. You just might want to use a standard shader. Although in the latest version of Arnold 5 dot whatever they're at now, it's the standard shader is deprecated, even though it's still there. But you'll see in a second what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's just call this mat1, and then we'll end up duplicating this network as we go. So we have our out material, and now the first thing we're going to need is a standard shader. So let's just do a tab, our surface, standard surface. Alright, so this is the Arnold standard surface, and normally you would just hook this up, a shader to the surface output, but we're going to bypass that for a second. And we're going to be reading in some user data. We're going to create some custom attributes on all of our objects to help us create object IDs, which we can then use in Fusion to sort of separate objects out. So let's go ahead and do that first, and then I'll show you how to reconnect all that. So let's start with our grid object. Usual suspect, we have our geometry there, and what we're going to do is attribute create. Okay, just connect that. Now you can shift right click on this to automatically connect that. I didn't do that in this case, but you know, normally that'll just help you create it automatically, have it attached. So anyway, here we go. Attribute, we're just going to call this object ID, like you see there. And this is going to be a detail class, and the way Arnold handles object IDs is as integer data. So integer, it also reads as 16-bit, so we'll change that, and we need to give it a value for every object that we're doing. The value that it reads here is this value here, and it's only the first field, right? So we could just start at 1 just for the sake of consistency, and just for good practice, let's go ahead and add a null. And like I said, if you do a shift right click and just start typing null, not bool, null, it'll automatically connect it just like that. Okay, we'll just call this our out grid, and let's go ahead and rename this to object ID. Alright, and what we can do is just copy these two nodes here, because we can just reuse them in our other objects. Right, so we just did that for the grid. Let's go ahead and do that for our object, or box, I'm sorry. Just hop in there, box, I to get in there, and paste. And then we'll just connect these up. Okay, now we have object ID again, but this time we're going to change the value to 2. So this is the object 2. Okay, and again, go into our sphere, paste, connect, and this one will be 3. And our last object is the torus. We'll go inside the torus, paste it, connect. Object ID will change to 4. Okay, so that writes all of the values for the different objects that we have. And if you're not sure, you could always, it's always good practice to check your geometry spreadsheet. So let's go ahead and just do that one by one. So we'll highlight our grid. And as I said, it was a detail attribute, right? So it's this very last one. And we see we have now an attribute called object ID with the value. Right? So there's 1. There's, well, we called that one 3, 4, 2. Alright. So we have 4 separate object IDs. Now we need to get this into the Arnold materials. So it'll read out the an object ID AOV from the materials that are assigned to this, right? So we'll go into our shop network, go to that first material that we started to create, and we need to get that value into this shader network, right? So the way that we do that is we use user data int, right? So we need to grab the information from the ethos inside Houdini, and let's go back to our detail here, properties. Okay, so the attribute that we wrote was called object ID. Alright. And if you want to, you could rename this. I like to do that just because I then know what I'm reading. Okay, so now we have that in our network, but we need to write it into the material, right? And that's a very simple process. You just type in the word write, because we're going to be creating an AOV, which is a pass called object ID, and it's an integer value because that's what we created. So we'll choose AOV write int, drop that in here, and all the AOV write int is looking for is what is the data the input. You might not be able to see this here, but it's looking for the input. What's the data? So the data that we grabbed was this object ID. So we'll grab that and wire it in. And the pass-through is, what am I applying this, what am I mixing this with? And that's our surface, right? So we'll grab our, shader output, pass that through, and then this shader goes right to the surface. Alright, and that would normally be it for this setup for that particular material. This is how you get object ID. And you can, if you want, you can go in and start, messing with all this. I'll take this a little step further. Sometimes for us Houdini people, sometimes you develop a habit where you actually work at the object level to do things like color separation. So what I'll do here is I will actually just create a color node. Shift right click, color, and I'll show you how to get that into Arnold. So let's say I wanted this first one to be, red. So we got a red floor. Just copy that color node, go into my box object, and we'll just insert that here. Paste. Oh, and this one we'll say is green. Alright, and sphere, same thing. And this one we'll make it blue. And what do we have? A torus left. Let's go to our torus. I to go inside of it. Control V to paste that node. Reconnect it to the output. And since we copied those out nodes, they're all out grid, so we'll go in and rename that real quick to, so let's say that one's purple. Okay. So this is not a grid, obviously, it's a torus. Sphere object in sphere. Let's clean it up a little bit. Okay. Grid. That one's going to be correct, obviously. Yeah. And then the box was the last one. Okay. So there we go. Now they all have unique colors, right? Now we can go back into our shop network, into that material, and we can also read this in so that the base color is always being read from that node. And again, that's a user data. Now color is RGB or RGB alpha. And we just pipe that in, the RGB right into the base color. Okay. And the data attribute that we're reading in Houdini is color, and the variable for that is capital C, lowercase d, right? So that gets us the color. Now that right there is the setup, basic setup for this type of thing. That gets us the object ID, okay, for every object. And then once you create that material, let's go up one, we could just paste that, control C and paste it for however number of materials we want. Now we have 4 objects in here, so I'll paste it 4 times, and we'll have 4 copies of that, right? And then all we have to do is assign these to the different objects, right? So let's start with the grid, render, in the geometry here, render tab material, and we'll just pick it from our shop network, right? Material 1, sphere object, let's make that material 2, torus object, let's make that material 3, and the last one, box, make that material 4. Okay, now we could probably use some lights for this and a camera, so let's go ahead and do that. Control click on the camera if you like your current view, and it'll match the view with the camera that you're looking through. And let's go ahead and create a couple of lights here. What do we want? A quad light. Let's do that. And let's just position this. Let's say I want this backlit from behind. Give it a little bit more intensity. Now Arnold tends to render pretty low exposure, so if you're coming from another render package like V-Ray or Octane, you'll need to just get in the habit of raising this up. And let's go ahead and put another point light in the front, just to give it a little bit of side light there. Alright, and let's go back to our camera view. Let's see what that gets us. And we go to our render. We already created that render ROP, and it'll look at our camera that we're using, and we should get something here. Okay, so there we go. There's our basic scene, and we can see that Arnold successfully read the different color nodes, and there we have it. Okay, let me just soften these lights a little bit, just because that's my personal taste. 1, 2, and then this quad light. Actually, that one's fine because that's kind of a softbox light. All right. I do think I want to raise that a little bit though. Let's go back to our scene view. Accidentally hit box. Quad light moving. There we go. Alright. Get that harsh glare off there. Okay, so that seems to be okay for what we're doing. Okay, let's move on. AOVs in Arnold, and that is actually done here. This little button here, open output driver parameters. You can also get to that by simply clicking on the ROP itself and looking at the parameters tab here. And you can set those here. Now I like to just click here to get a floating window. And since I'm recording this, my screen space is a little limited. Okay, so we have properties here, output. First thing we need to do is, right now it's outputting to the IP viewer. Let's change this to sequence of EXR files. Now this would also work for whatever else you're using. You just have to be careful to match that down your line here when you're creating your image sequences. Okay, so this will automatically create an image sequence in the folder where the project is saved. Alright, so if we save this as AOV Arnold Fusion in our Arnold Fusion folder here that I've created, this sequence is just going to pop up right next to this hip file. We don't necessarily want that. I know that this output picture, this first one, is going to be my beauty pass, which has everything already pre-composited in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, after this R dot, this is the renderer by the way, I'm going to just type beauty to name this pass as the beauty pass. Also, I'm going to type here beauty slash, right, and then we'll create a folder in the hip project folder, AOV Arnold Fusion slash beauty slash, and then the project name and which pass it is. All right, so we're going to follow that idea going down the line here with the AOVs that we create. So first thing we did was create an object ID. Remember that? So we're going to go down here and select our object ID, and we know that it's an integer value. So this type here, we know it's going to be an integer. Okay, we want it in a separate folder, and it's going to be a sequence of EXR files. Now, there's two options that we have here. We could go through and manually type, the different, pass names and all that stuff, or we could just simply have it be driven by the AOV name. So in this case, it's the ID. What I like to do is right-click on this and copy the parameter, and then have the AOV name actually be the folder name and the image sequence name. So again, I'll go in here right before the hip name, and I will use right-click, paste relative references, and that will just grab the channel name, add that slash, and now it'll create a folder that matches that name. I will also go after the R, like I said, and do the same thing. Paste it, paste relative reference, and remember to hit the dot after. So now we have R, which will be Arnold Render dot ID, object ID, and then all the other information, the frame. This $F4 is the frame number as a 4-character sequence. Okay, and then what we can do, so we don't have to do this for all the different AOVs we want, we could just simply copy the entire string. Alright, and now when we add AOVs, say I want a diffuse direct, which is our color pass, and say I want a separate folder, I can just paste that whole string there and just change this AOV label to 2. And how do I know it's 2? Because if I hover over this, you can see it's AR underscore AOV underscore label 2. Alright, so this is all I have to change there. And you can also see, like, if you were unsure, that it actually gives you in the drop down what it is. Okay, so there's my diffuse direct, and then it'll have a folder name and a pass for it. So let's add another one. Let's say we want our different speculars. Specular direct, separate file. Let's be AOV3 and AOV3. And let's add another one. Specular indirect. Okay. So the specular direct is like all these little white highlights you're seeing here. And the specular indirect is actually the sort of the color specular that you're getting from bounces. There's more about that in the Arnold manual if you want the heady details on it. So this is 4, and just for good measure, we're going to throw in a shadow pass. This will not be the same as covering shadow mats. I may do that in a separate video, but this will just be the shadow pass, and I'll show you how to get that to composite correctly in Fusion. There's a couple of steps you need to do with the channel booleans to get that to read right. Now, a point of confusion for some is that it is called shadow matte here. It's not technically a matte because the alpha itself is actually just a one solid matte. So this is just a matter of opinion, but the word matte might be slightly misleading because it doesn't actually have a matte of just the shadows, like a shadow catcher behavior that you might be used to seeing when you're doing that process. So just a bit of fair warning there when you're doing a shadow matte out of this, that set your expectations that it's just the full image. The alpha is just the full image and the shadows are there. You'll see in a second when we do this in Fusion. Okay, so in theory, when we render this frame, it should go and create all these folders and then have an image in there for each one. Now at this point you might be asking, or noting that in the beginning of the video I had said that OpenEXR is a format where you don't have to separate all this out into separate image sequences. That you could just, I could have just gone in and said, make me these AOVs not as a separate file into one EXR, and it should work. And you'd be absolutely correct. It does absolutely work like that when you are consistent in the versioning between your applications. The unfortunate thing in the case of BlackMagic Fusion at the moment, and I'm very hopeful that they're going to address this very soon, is that they are unable to read properly the EXR 2.x, whatever it's at. So this extracting of the different layers inside the EXR file does not function properly at the moment in Fusion. So if you're using Fusion, this is what you have to do. And so this is what I'm showing you for those users out there that might hit this brick wall, so that you're not feeling like you're just up the creek without a paddle. So that being said, let me go ahead and grab a folder here so we could just make sure that we're seeing where this is all going to end up. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and kick off a render to disk, and see if I get what I expect to see here. Okay, so I just hit that and it created all these folders. And inside we have the file that we expect to see. Okay, so let me go back one step. So our main folder, our project folder, was this AOV Arnold Fusion, right? And this is where the main Houdini project is saved. And by default, if I'd have just said output the picture to the default format that it would have, all of these different images that we're seeing in these folders would just all pop up in this folder, and it would kind of be a mess. So in order to separate that out, that's why we went through and did all of those formatting changes that we did here. So it creates the folder. So we have our beauty pass, and then inside that beauty pass is actually the beauty EXR, right? Okay. Now we created an object ID pass in this, but we actually didn't need to do that because that ID pass is actually embedded in this beauty EXR. However, it's not going to be embedded in the other one. So diffuse, shadow, specular, and specular indirect. And I'll show you that right now. So let's go ahead and jump into Fusion now that we've done this. First, let's go ahead and save our project file. Okay. I'll leave that up for a second so you can see it. And let's go ahead and jump to Fusion. Alright. So all we have to do now with this is we could just actually grab the folders that we're interested in. Now, like I said, that ID pass that we did, this particular ID output, I didn't really need this as a separate folder, so disregard that section of what I said because it's already embedded in a beauty. So I'm just going to control click and select the different passes that I know that I want, and I'm going to just drag those folders into Fusion, and it's going to load them in automatically and do merges. But we're going to go ahead and disconnect these merges because we're going to do something a little different here. Okay, so let's just zoom in on these, and you can see we have our beauty. Right, diffuse direct, this is just the color. Shadow matte, specular, and our specular indirect, which is hard to see here. Now it looks very dark coming into Fusion because it's a different color space. The gamma needs to be updated to what's coming out of Houdini and Arnold, which is a 2.2 gamma space. So if you wanted to see that correctly, all you would do is just add a gamma node. Okay, and we're going to do an output space of custom in 2.2. because I already know that that's what's coming out of Arnold, and there we go. Okay, so if you ever see this when you bring it in and you're going, what's going on? It's because the default in BlackMagic is 1.0 linear space, gamut space, and coming out of Arnold, it's 2.2. And there you go for that. Okay, so how do we see our object ID that we created in this beauty pass in Fusion? You would just hit this drop down and it should show up in there. If you're not used to working with passes, you don't know that you had to actually go into OpenEXR files under the Format tab of your image and go down to Object ID and map it. Right? So, interestingly enough, it's not there. You would normally see an ID at the bottom here, and I'm not seeing that. That's because it went out into a separate pass. That's why. Okay, so yeah, I guess I kind of lied earlier. This object ID is not there. Okay, so this is actually good that this happened because it's kind of a flub. So here's the thing. We made that ID pass, right? Thinking that we were just going to be able to bring it in. Now the thing is that this ID pass is just an integer value. It's not RGB data, so we don't really get anything out of it just looking at it. And even if we go into the format here, OpenEXR, and we say, I know I have an object ID in there, try to map it, I'm not going to get anything out of it because this pass, even though it's integer data, is just reading out, color, right? The way Fusion sees it. So see, it just has this Y channel, and that's not going to help us, right? So that's actually a good mistake to make. So what we're going to do is we're going to get this object ID back into the beauty pass in Houdini, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Bring up our render operator, and on our object ID where we had write it out to a separate file, let's uncheck that. Okay, so it's still going to be an integer value, but it's going to be embedded inside of this first image, this beauty pass. Okay, and we'll just go ahead and render that out again. Render to disk, and give it a second. You can watch it here as it updates. And there we go. The image is done, and we don't need to bring those back into Fusion. When you go into Fusion, you can simply select all these and hit Control P, and that basically bypasses them, and then hit Control P again, and it refreshes the loading of that image. So now when we look at this this beauty pass, it now will have an object ID embedded in it, which it does not, which is strange. Okay, try that again. That is really odd. Hold on a second. Same as beauty, integer. Preserve layer name. I think this is where we might have had a problem. Okay. One more time. Just waiting for the 0 to update. Okay, well, it's still 8411 kilobytes, so I'm suspecting that the image did not actually write out with the object ID. It did not. And just for testing sake, let's go ahead and just delete all of that. Right? And I'm going to delete all of this just to clear it out. I'm also going to clear the cache in Fusion. Go back to Houdini. Let's save our file just to make sure that everything is the current thing. And let's re-render it again. folders again. Eight four 8411. Go back into Fusion. Grab our folders. Bring them in. Kill these merges. This loader. Go to the format, channels, object ID, and there it is. Okay, so what you just witnessed there was one of those gotchas that, you know, sometimes you have to just kind of start over, I guess, fresh, because, you know, it could be the cache, the memory cache, or whatever. Things are going wonky. So the steps were correct in that, but we weren't seeing it. So again, this is a good thing, good reason why, you know, not to pause the video. And here you see object ID. All right, so there we go. Now we have object IDs in that main beauty pass. All right, so let's go through the process of reconnecting all this stuff. Now, like I said, this is meant to be a very basic, rudimentary workflow. These different passes do not have object ID in them, which is correct. Okay, so first thing we need to do is take care of the gamut issue. Now, there's two ways you can do this. You could either merge all these images together the way you want, and then add a gamut, or you can add a gamut after each node. Just for the sake of speeding things up here, I'll just go ahead and we'll merge these first and then deal with all that. The shadow is going to be the last one, because that's going to be a multiply operation. Oop. Click happy there. Alright, so we have our diffuse. We're going to merge it with our specular direct. Okay, and specular is add, and in Fusion, that's screen. So you can see that they're starting to show up there. We're going to merge that with the specular indirect, and that it's also add, which is screen again. It's difficult to see in the monitor here, but there's additional specular going on, which will show that with the gamut. And then lastly, we're going to merge our shadows. But here's the trick with the shadows. So let me switch this back to color. Let's take a look at our shadows. So if you're used to looking at shadow passes, you notice a problem immediately with this image, in that it's backwards. It's inside out, inverted. This white should be black, this black should be white. So how do we fix that in Fusion? We use our handy dandy channel booleans. And that's the second one here. Wire that in. Let's view it. And all we want to do here is change the operation to negative. And the alpha, we don't want to do anything with our alpha. Okay. So do nothing on the alpha. And now this particular node here, that's a proper representation of what we want. And now we can merge that with the rest of our image here, and this is going to be a multiply operation. Okay, and to get it in the proper gamut space, let's add our handy gamut node. And again, this is our custom 2.2 we want. Okay, so what we have here is our image rebuilt. That is the same as our beauty. Okay, obviously minus the gamut. Let's go ahead and put one on that just so we can see it correctly. One custom 2.2. Okay, so same image. We just rebuilt it from the different passes that we had here. Okay, and obviously from a compositing standpoint, you know, from hopefully doing some basic projects at this point, now that you have access to these things, you can you know, do things to them like color processing and all that. Now, we talked about object ID before, and we were curious about, well, how is that going to be used in Fusion? Fusion doesn't have a built-in sort of object ID separator, you know, from the EXR and all that kind of stuff. There's scripts out there that we can use that will do that, but unfortunately, the ones that are available do not function correctly because of the EXR situation, where the standard in Fusion is not up to the 2.x that I was telling you about before. So some of those plugins and scripts are actually broken, or in some cases don't even install correctly, which is the case for me. So you might be saying to yourself, well, so much for that. I can't use any of this stuff. Well, that's not really true. I'll show you how you can get these objects separated out. So if I'm using this and I want to say separate out this sphere, to say change the color of it, all I have to do is first copy this beauty pass node, okay, or in my case, if I'm saying color, this diffuse, copy it, paste it, and what I want to do is I want to create a mask of just that sphere based on this object ID. So I can just simply connect a bitmap mask to this node, and the driver that I'm using to create this bitmap mask is going to come from this object ID, right? So let's go ahead and get rid of this here for a second. Now the handy thing in this bitmap mask is that I have the option to use object in the controls. So I just click use object, and this little pick button here, if I just left click and hold it and hover over, I'm going to get the value of that here. And now when I look at this, I have just my image of that object, right? And that would hold true for any other object I selected, okay? And that's how you get it out of there. And let's say I wanted to, change the color of that to, let's view it first. Say red or green or whatever. Okay, so now I went from blue to red, and I could substitute my diffuse out of there, and now I'm just getting a red ball there where it was blue before. Now I didn't do that obviously with the other objects, which is why we're seeing there's no color there, because we masked it out. But we could just simply merge those together with the original, and that would do that. But there you have it. I think that covers the basic idea of how to get this to work properly in Fusion. No, we don't want to mask there, silly. Okay, so if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. And I think that's it. So good luck, and I hope to hear from you soon.